Now, since certain types, like this object type here, for example, can become rather complex and a bit longer, it is also quite common to outsource them and to not define them in line as I'm doing it here. And you can do that with TypeScript by grabbing the type you want to outsource and by creating a so-called type alias. You do that with the type keyword, which is a keyword made available by TypeScript. And then you pick any type name of your choice. For example, user. And the convention is to start with an uppercase character here. Then you use an equal sign, but as a value, you now assign a type definition, because this is a pure TypeScript feature. So in this case, this user object type I just cut. And now you can use your own type here, this type alias, user in my case, in all the places where this type is expected and required, like this now. Now, when you're dealing with an object type, as we do it here, you also have an alternative to setting up a type like this. You can create a so-called interface, which is another TypeScript feature. And an interface is simply another way of defining an object type, you could say. And you'll see both approaches out there in the wild, which is why I will show you both approaches here. Now, the question whether to use a type or an interface is a question that can lead to a long discussion. The short answer is that in many situations it doesn't matter and you can use what you prefer. In Angular projects, it's a bit more common to see interfaces, but ultimately it is down to you. If you were to define such an object type as an interface, you would do that by using the interface keyword. And then by again using any name of your choice, like user. And then without an equal sign, you add curly braces and then your property definitions. So like this. And now you would have the same result as before, just with this different approach. Again, you would have your own object type. One key difference to the type keyword is that with interface, you can really only define object types. With the type keyword, you can also define other types, of which you'll see some later in this course. And therefore now with that, we got the same application as before. It still works as before, but now you learned a bit more about TypeScript and you will need that knowledge for the rest of this course, and also most importantly, when working as an Angular developer. Now, I want to come back to this list of users here. We got a list of users, that's nice, but it's not really a dynamically rendered list. Instead, we're manually outputting 4 users here, and we're manually controlling which user we're accessing here. And of course, the problem with that is that in reality, we have more than 4 users. We have 6 in this case. Now, of course, we could simply add 2 more list items here, but that would only help in this situation. What if you're building an application where you have a list of data that dynamically changes, where new items might be added or items might be removed? In that case, and also in a case like here, where I don't want to copy and paste and set up all that code manually, it would be nice to have some Angular feature that allows us to dynamically render that list, and that allows us to output as many list items as we need for the data we have in a list. And it turns out that such a feature, of course, exists in Angular. Here in this unordered list, instead of outputting all those list items like this, we can use a special Angular syntax to dynamically render that list. And that syntax looks like this. At for, so almost like the for loop you know from JavaScript, just with an extra at in front of it, so that Angular can easily detect it in your templates. Then parentheses, and then user of users. Though this word here, user, is up to you. You can use any name you want here. This word, on the other hand, is not up to you. This must refer to some property of your component class which holds the list data through which you want to loop, so which holds an array. Then you add curly braces, opening and closing, and then you put the code that should be repeated for every user, in this case, between those curly braces. Now we can get rid of all these other list items because now they will be output dynamically. At least soon, because as you can see, at the moment we still got an error here. And the error I'm getting here is that such a for loop must have a track expression. This is solved by adding a semicolon after this first part of this for loop statement, and by then adding the track keyword and then user.id here. And with that, the error goes away. And I'll explain what this track thing does in just a second. But with that, we're now replicating this list item once per user in our users array. And the individual user for which this item is being replicated is made available through that user variable here, which is available inside of this for block. And we can use this user variable to then easily pass a specific user to every app user component instance, so that different instances of this component receive different users. With that, if we save that, you will see that we now have the full list of users, and of course we got that result with way simpler code. Now, what's the idea behind this track thing which we had to add? Well, the thing is that of course we're dynamically outputting list data here, and Angular internally wants to keep track of every item that is being rendered, so that if the list input data would change, if we would shuffle the list items around or remove some items, Angular could easily reuse already rendered list items and doesn't have to recreate the entire list every time the list data changes. With this track expression here, we're telling Angular which unique identification criteria can be assigned by Angular automatically behind the scenes to every list item, in this case, to every element it's rendering per user. And here it's that user ID, which will be unique per user. And Angular will basically connect that ID to every list item it outputs, so that every list item has a different ID, and that then helps Angular update the list if the list data would change. It helps Angular update that list in a highly efficient way. Here it doesn't really matter because users will never change. Nonetheless, you always must add such a track expression. But with that, we can now output list content. And as you will see throughout the course, this is a crucial feature which you will be using a lot. So outputting list data is an important Angular feature, but another important Angular feature, which you'll also use in templates a lot, is being able to output conditional content. So content that should only be rendered under certain circumstances. For example here, this tasks component, because we might not always have a selected user. Now, at the moment in our app, we indeed do, but we can easily change this by going to the app component TypeScript file, and there, instead of setting the selected user ID to an initial value of U1, we could set it up like this and not give it an initial value. In that case, we have to define the type of value it will eventually hold, which would be a string. And we have to add a question mark here to tell TypeScript that it's fine that this might not be set. But with that change made, we now indeed not always have a selected user. And we then might not want to render this tasks component at all, because at the moment we would render it and essentially show nothing for the user's name. But if you would inspect the DOM, you would see that the h2 element is actually rendered. It just doesn't contain any content. But rendering an element that has no text, that's not really great and typically not something we want to do. It should not be rendered at all if we have no selected user. And that's where another useful Angular template feature comes into play. Just as we have @for for outputting lists, we have @if for outputting conditional content. Now @if takes a pair of parentheses, and then between those parentheses we define the condition we want to check, just as we do it with if statements in JavaScript or TypeScript code. So here we could simply check if selected user is defined, or if selected user ID is defined, but here we can check for the overall selected user, because that will be undefined if the selected user ID is undefined, because in that case find here would yield an undefined value. So the selected user will be undefined if we don't have an ID. And hence here we can check if we do have a selected user, so if this is truthy, and then we add curly braces, and then the markup that should be rendered if this condition is met. Now, of course, we know that inside of these curly braces, the selected user will be defined, because we only make it in there if we have a selected user. Otherwise, this here will not be rendered. And therefore, we can simplify this code here again and get rid of this check, and instead just write it like this. And TypeScript, with help of Angular, does indeed understand that selected user will never be undefined in here, and hence we don't have to add any question marks or exclamation marks here. It just works like this. Now, of course, we might want to show some fallback text if no user was selected yet, and that's why Angular also allows you to add a else block with @else. So not just else, but @else. And here we could then output a paragraph with an idea of fallback maybe for styling purposes. And then here say select a user to see their tasks. With that, if you save this, you will see that initially you see that fallback text. But if you now click on a user, you instead see their name. And that, of course, is an improvement and shows you how you can use if and else to render conditional content.